Hello and welcome to New England Desserts. My name is Lily Weitzman and I am a programming librarian here at the library. I'd like to thank New TV for being here filming today's program. And now I am pleased to introduce tonight's speaker. Tammy Donroe Inman is a trained chef, cooking instructor, and award-winning author and photographer. She sharpened her knives testing recipes for Cook's Illustrated magazine and the TV show America's Test Kitchen. Her first cookbook, Wintersweet, Seasonal Desserts to Warm the Home, received rave reviews from the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Library Journal, and Publishers Weekly. Her current cookbook, New England Desserts, won the New England Book of the Year, and she just finished her third cookbook, New England Brunch, which comes out next year. A former editor for Boston Magazine, she's also written for Fine Cooking, Yankee, and the Boston Globe. She lives outside Boston with her family, 2 high-maintenance cats, and a pair of well-worn roller skates. Welcome, Tammy.
Thank you, Lily, for that introduction. And also thank you, Lena, for filming this for those who couldn't make it. And thank you, sir, for joining us. This is one of my favorite times of year to talk about New England desserts and seasonal baking. We've just come off of Thanksgiving, we're heading into the rest of the holidays, and we're doing all of our pies, all of our traditional recipes, and I like to take this opportunity to talk about all of the New England desserts that are on offer, not just around the holidays. So I'll speak for about 20 minutes about seasonal baking, the history of some of our favorite New England desserts, and some new creative ideas for New England desserts. And then maybe some holiday ideas, and then I'll open it up to questions. Okay, so I live in Waltham. I went to culinary school right after college at Tufts, and I have worked in the test kitchen of Cook's Illustrated, worked in America's Test Kitchen, so I have a lot of experience testing recipes, and baking is definitely my sweet spot. As Lily mentioned, I have 3 cookbooks. This is my second one, and it is all about the things that you can make during the different seasons. I was born in Maine. I lived in New Hampshire and outside of Boston for most of my life. So I have spent my life traveling around New England, being exposed to seasons and the different cuisine in the different states. And it is one of my favorite things to do is to celebrate the seasons with food. So if I might ask, what are your favorite New England desserts? Do you have any favorites?
Pumpkin pie.
Pumpkin pie, 100%, 100%. There's a lot of them showing up on the screen. So pumpkin pie is probably, apple pie, pumpkin pie, and maybe Indian pudding are probably the oldest ones and the most popular ones. And those are definitely in the cookbook. And I wanted to talk about the different things that I considered in terms of what was a New England dessert, because I wanted to make sure that I covered all the states and all the different regions, and sort of some of the very popular desserts and some of the often overlooked ones. So, for example, things that were invented in New England include chocolate chip cookies. A lot of people know that the Toll House recipe was invented here in Massachusetts, in Whitman, at the Toll House Inn. And it wasn't that long ago, it was 1938 that it was invented. And it seems like, well, why didn't anybody think of that sooner? It's so obvious now. But back before that time, chocolate was very bitter. It was bitter and grainy and not all that sweet. And so most people would melt the chocolate and then mix it into their baked goods. And it took somebody, that maybe didn't have quite enough chocolate to make a full batch and decided, oh, I'm just gonna, or didn't have the time to melt it, and they chopped it up and added to the cookies. And it was just a brilliant decision that has many, many followers and lovers of chocolate chip cookies. So now it is not just a Massachusetts thing or a New England thing, it's beloved all over the country and the world. Other New England desserts that were invented here that you might not know about are Vermont maple creamies. If you've spent any time in Montpelier or northern Vermont, you'll find this soft serve ice cream made with maple sugar or maple syrup, and it's absolutely delicious. You don't really see it anywhere else in New England, even though we have maple trees all over New England and we have maple syrup all over New England. It's just one of those very special recipes. Another one is called Needhams, and they're Maine potato candies. And it sounds terrible to imagine potato in a candy, but it's actually quite delicious. It's basically a coconut cream candy. They use mashed potatoes as a binder to thicken it because potatoes are the main crop of Maine, and they needed reasons to use it. So instead of using flour or cornstarch to thicken up the filling of the candy, they used mashed potatoes, and it's delicious. My teenage boys were very skeptical when I made these candies and told them what was in it, but they came around very quickly. It was also very important to me to have the seasons highlighted. I'm a very seasonal cook. I wasn't always that way, but once I started shopping at farmers markets and started to understand the flow of, the agricultural flow of crops, you find that you get the best flavor and the best prices when you buy things that are in season. So that means in the spring, I make a lot of strawberry and rhubarb desserts. In the summer, there's a lot of berries, blueberries, raspberries, a lot of stone fruits like peaches and plums and cherries, and as well as melons like watermelon and honeydew and cantaloupe. I actually organized the book by season so that, if you go to the farmer's market in the fall, fall, there's pretty much everything there at that time of year. You've got the tail end of summer, and you've got the beginning of the apples and the pears and the cranberries. So it's really, you just have your choice. But you can open up to that chapter and kind of know, well, this is what's in season, and I can find all of these ingredients right now. Winter is a little different. Obviously there's not a lot coming out of the fields when there's snow on the ground, but there's still a lot that's seasonal in the winter, because back in the old days, before refrigeration, when we were using root cellars, people would keep apples, they would keep root vegetables like squash, actually that's a gourd, but like carrots, and use those things all season long. Parsnips, those can be used in cakes like carrot cake. You can even make cake out of turnip. And beets. And then there's also spices and nuts and dried fruits that figure a lot into the winter desserts that we see on our table at this time of year. Other things I wanted to include were recipes with native ingredients. So that includes the foods that were growing here before any settlement occurred, before the British came, before any immigrants came. So that's corn, that's maple syrup, that's things that were growing here wild, like strawberries and blueberries, cranberries, black raspberries, as well as the crops that the indigenous peoples, like the Algonquin tribes, were cultivating at that time. So that includes, in addition to corn, pumpkins and squash. And in fact, those words, those Algonquin words, became, or they were derived, the English words were derived from the Algonquin words. Does anybody, have you heard of maple sugar on snow? Yeah, okay. So it's basically a candy that the Native Americans made during the sugar season, which was at the tail end of the winter, beginning of spring. And they would make maple syrup, so take the sap, boil it down until it was very thick, and then they would make a little trough in the fresh snow, pour the syrup on, and the temperature, the cold temperature, would cause the syrup to seize, and it would thicken. And you could roll it up on the stick, and it ended up like a maple taffy. So it was a delicious candy that was enjoyed at that time of year during harvest season. So those were the kinds of things that I wanted to incorporate into the desserts. Other ingredients were ones that the British brought over. So apples, we think of apples as the quintessential New England ingredient. But actually we didn't see apples here until after 1620, because the settlers brought apple cuttings, like actual plants, here to recreate their cottage gardens. And so that was true for pears, that was true for quince, rhubarb, and apples, of course, took off, spreading by seed, from birds, from humans, from other animals, and we ended up getting a lot of apple varieties that were specific to New England. So for example, the Roxbury russet is an old heirloom apple that was found just growing wild in Roxbury, Massachusetts. That was in 1635, and that's considered to be the first New England heirloom apple. Because apples, they were actually originated in Kazakhstan, and then they had to make their way across, the continent to Europe and then come here. So they traveled a while. The British also brought wheat. Wheat was not here before then. We had corn. That was the main staple, main carbohydrate here, just like rice in Asia. But the British brought wheat, and of course that is the main starch that we use for pastries and all kinds of baking. The British brought a lot of their sort of meat pie-based knowledge and pudding knowledge to bring us a lot of these sort of old Yankee recipes that we carry through today. And not just, pies, but also things like crisps and cobblers and pandownies and all kinds of interesting things that you can make with scraps and just bits and pieces of things. So it wasn't just ingredients that got brought here. It was techniques and it was culture, really. And then, once other immigrant groups came here, there were French, Canadian, and German, and Italian, and really everybody after a while, and you end up with a melting pot of influences. Myself, I'm half Italian, so of course that comes through in some of my ingredients and some of my techniques. When I was a kid, nobody had biscotti on their Christmas plates unless you were Italian, but now everybody has biscotti on their plates. Right now we have a huge Latin American population around here, and also Brazilian, and I will not be surprised if I see pumpkin flan on my Thanksgiving table soon enough. It's just really interesting the way people bring their cultures and they adapt to what we have here. So it's wonderful. But mostly for me, I just really am attracted to the unfussy nature of New England baking. It's, it makes use of the seasons. It's not too hard. I will even say that pies are not that hard. Once you know how to make them, they're really not that hard. And we just have a lot of things that we make that aren't really fussy, like cookies and puddings and ice cream. So I wanted to make sure that we sort of carried some of those old recipes through to the next generation. And also be creative about it, because there's a lot of things you can do with seasonal fruit, not just like apple pies. We can do other things with apples that are interesting. So the cover here, this is actually an apple galette, so a free-form tart that has apples and cranberries, and then a caramel sauce on top. So I took the caramel apple idea and just made it be a baked caramel apple situation. So let's talk about just a couple of desserts that have interesting histories. So we talked about pumpkin pie, and that is definitely an important one because it was probably one of the very first earliest recipe that was both British and Native American at the same time. So really a fusion recipe of New England. It was not in a crust. It couldn't have been in a crust, because wheat was not here yet during that very first winter when the settlers arrived. They had nothing. They were in rough shape. And we know the story of the first Thanksgiving, and the Algonquins collaborated with the British to sort of help them grow, show them how to grow the corn and how to grind it, etc. And squash was something that would have been on a table, roasted, mashed squash. That was something that the native peoples ate regularly. And then over time, the British would have taken that and added other ingredients that they would have used in their custards, such as eggs and sugar. Well, they didn't have regular sugar yet, but they did have maple sugar or maple syrup, which acted the same. Probably it was served in an empty gourd or a shell of a pumpkin because it didn't have a crust. It probably was not baked originally, but then once eggs were added, it was baked. and eventually a crust was added. Once the spice trade happened, and Salem and Boston were very important in the spice trade, then spices were added. And molasses was added during the sugar trade because that became cheaper than maple syrup because of the essentially free labor that was that the slaves were providing against their will. Hi, come on in. And then, after apple pie, after pumpkin pie, there was apple pie, and then there was blueberry pie, and pies were made with everything. Everything that could be made into a pie would be made into a pie. Another very old recipe or old dessert is Indian pudding, which we don't call it that anymore. The reason that it was, so does anybody know, are you familiar with Indian pudding? Is that something that yeah? Okay, so if you haven't had it before, it's essentially a pudding made with cornmeal. It's like a porridge, and it's sweetened either with molasses or maple syrup, and it usually has some kind of spices in it, but not always, and it's usually served warm with a dollop of vanilla ice cream melting all over the place. And for me, it is the epitome of New England. Like, it is my favorite childhood dessert. It's warm, it's comforting, it's not too sweet. It's a huge favorite of mine. So how it came about is that the Algonquin tribes were making a porridge called the samp, made with cornmeal. They didn't sweeten it much, if we sweetened it at all. They did not really have dessert as a course. It was syrup or maple sugar was used more like a spice than a sweetener, and so it was added to give flavor or to preserve meat and fish, the way Europeans use salt. So they did make a cornmeal porridge, but it was the British that sweetened it and added some spicing. And the reason they called it Indian pudding is because the British settlers referred to cornmeal as Indian meal, because the Indians, they're not Indians, but at the time they thought they were the ones that showed them how to grow and grind the corn. So, and Indian pudding still survives to this day, but it's hard to find. Durgan Park has closed. You used to find it at Hearth and Kettle. I think maybe Cracker Barrel. I don't know. You can find it on some old diner menus, but it's a favorite, and it's really easy to make at home in either a slow cooker or you can just make it in the oven. Whoopie pies. Whoopie pies are one of our favorite New England desserts. And it's claimed by folks across New England, such as Maine and Massachusetts, but also in Pennsylvania, for folks who live in Pittsburgh or the Amish country area there. Whoopie pies are very popular. They're called by a different name. They usually call them gobs. And it has something to do with the mining culture of the area, or the mining industry. But how did they get the name whoopie pie? We don't know exactly who invented it, but we know that it's common in those areas, and it tends to pop up in places where German immigrants have settled, so the Pennsylvania Dutch. So it's very possible that the Germans had something to do with that. Like, they kind of all migrated from the same area. Maybe they made something similar to that in Germany, and it just kind of from there spread. But the name, we know, came from a very specific thing that happened in Boston. There was a bakery called the Berwick Cake Company. It was located in Roxbury, and they were making the whoopie pies, which are the chocolate sandwich cakes with the filling, cream filling. And they weren't really selling for some reason, so they were looking for some sort of like marketing ploy or publicity stunt. So they heard that the Broadway show Whoopie was coming to town from New York. You can come in. And the bakers asked the play folks if they could distribute whoopie pies during intermission. And they got the green light, so they wrapped them up and they threw them out to the audience during intermission, and everybody loved them, of course. Who wouldn't love a free whoopie pie? So they ended up naming, or they became known as, those cakes that we had at the Whoopie Pie show, or at the Whoopie Broadway show. So people were just calling them that, and so they started using that as the name. Then there was copyright issue, so they had to change the spelling of the name from Whoopi with 2 E's at the end to Whoopi with IE at the end. So that's where the name came from. And that was in 1929. We've already talked about chocolate chip cookies. Let's talk about Boston cream pie. So that originated, yes, in Boston at the Parker House Hotel, which was also very famous for its rolls. It's still there. It's called the Omni Parker House, and they invented the Boston cream pie in 1855. If you haven't had Boston cream pie, it's vanilla cake. It's a big vanilla cake split through the middle, and it has vanilla cream in the middle, and it's got chocolate on top. Originally, it was chocolate fondant, but I don't like that. I like ganache. So my recipe has chocolate ganache on top, which is much chocolatier. I have been to that hotel, and it is really good. It's very good. And I was going to include that recipe in this book and credit it to the originators of that recipe. But the recipe actually called for a dozen eggs, and I just can't bring myself to use a dozen eggs in one recipe. So I came up with my own recipe that used half a dozen eggs and still tastes just as good, I think better. Fig Newtons. So here we are in Newton, and it is true that Fig Newtons were named after the city of Newton. I wasn't sure if that was like an urban legend, but it turns out that it's very true. There was a bakery in Cambridge called the F.A. Kennedy Steam Bakery. It was located in Cambridgeport, and they made a bunch of different cookies and crackers that they would name after different communities around Boston. Apparently there was a Shrewsbury, there was a Beacon Hill, but the one that had lasting appeal was the Fig Newton. And the Fig Newton was basically a riff on the British fig roll. And the reason that, or one of the reasons why it became so popular is because people really liked fig rolls, but they were hard to make. They were kind of a pain. The dough was very soft, and there were other issues too. The filling was very sticky. So James Henry Mitchell came up with a patented extrusion machine that allowed the filling to be piped through the dough, and this was during the Industrial Revolution, and was able to pipe it very consistently, cut it very consistently, and have everything mechanized. So it made it really easy and really fast and convenient to make these Fig Newtons, and people loved them. It's still one of the most popular cookies ever, after the chocolate chip cookie. I feel like everybody has a secret addiction to Fig Newtons and doesn't tell anybody. My husband keeps them in the back of the fridge because he likes to eat them cold. And I do have a recipe in my cookbook, but I will say, in all honesty, it's a pain. You only need to make it once to understand why people would want to buy a Fig Newton instead of making it. It can be done. They're equally good, but Fig Newtons are amazing. Sometimes industrialization can work to our advantage. And I think there's a few others. Oh, I will talk about panucci because, okay, do we know what panucci is? Has anybody heard of that? Brown sugar fudge. And it is only known by that name in New England and in Hawaii. And those could not be any further apart in terms of still being in the United States. So I was trying to figure out why is it like that? And I did some research, and it seems as though it was a Portuguese invention. You can find it in those two places because there was a lot of immigration from the Azores, which are islands off the coast of Portugal. They're kind of in the middle of the Atlantic. There was a lot of immigration there during the times of whaling. Portuguese were known for their whaling prowess, their fishing prowess, as well as they also immigrated to work in the mills, the textile mills in Lowell and Lawrence and such. They were also recruited by Hawaiian sugarcane planters because they were known to be great workers, and the Portuguese had kind of a head start on sugar production, or the understanding of sugar, how it worked, how it was grown, because at some period in history, the wars, the sort of Muslim population, there was a sort of a migration, and they occupied areas in Spain, in Portugal, some of the Mediterranean islands, like, I want to say Corsica, but I'm not 100% sure, but a lot of those southern islands, parts of Italy, and sugarcane was planted there. People learned how to use it, and it's like sugar is a very interesting, it's one of the most interesting ingredients in terms of like its history. It has a very dark history. And in terms of like what you can do with it and its chemical properties. So it wasn't just something like that you would just grow and suddenly like you know how to make all of this stuff. It took centuries for people to understand how to work with sugar, what its uses were. So anyways, so this brown sugar fudge predates chocolate fudge. It's basically just sugar, milk, butter, and one more thing, salt, just a pinch. And it resembles the Portuguese recipe for caramellos. And I actually had the good fortune to go to the Azores recently, and I was talking to people there as best I could in my English to try to figure out, if this was the same thing. And it is. It's the same recipe with one small adjustment, which is that you stir it as it's cooling instead of letting it sit. So it's a little bit smoother, it's a little bit creamier. I just love it. So anyways, I'm gonna open it up to questions. We can talk about holiday baking, if you have any questions about cookbooks or what you should make for, I don't know, any event you're coming up for. Yes?
I was just wondering, is it true that the Native Americans in Massachusetts already had been growing maize and had a recipe for eating corn as well as popping corn?
That's absolutely correct, yes. Popping corn was the very first corn to have been cultivated from a type of grass in Mexico called teosinte, and all the other types of corn came from that. So popping corn was eaten, like they would take the cobs and throw it into like the fire, and like the popcorn would like pop off the cob. That was originally how it was made. They would make maple popcorn balls. So popcorn was important to eat. It was important for like religious ceremonies and stuff. And then from there, like we've got our sweet corn, we've got our the corn that you dry and grind. And yes, they had a complete diet, complete nutritional, diet before anybody ever got here. And it had corn, it had, the local berries, it had cultivated squash and beans. They would hunt for bear or moose. They would fish, clam. So they had an amazing diet. Even before anybody came here. So a lot of people don't realize that, that they had their own complete culture. Yes?
My follow-up is, isn't it true that the Germans brought over beet sugar, in the 19th century? They've been growing beets. They're very large, tubers that can be turned into molasses and then turned into crystals.
That's absolutely right, yeah. So the thing with beets that made it important, so sugarcane can only grow in like the very warmest regions. It doesn't do so well in the north, but beets do really well in the north. And so a lot of the northern European countries started to grow beets as an alternative because it was cheaper, it adapted to their climate, and you can do all the same things with cane sugar that you can do with beet sugar. And in fact, I think at this point in time, like 50% of sugar, regular granulated sugar in the US is made from beets, as far as I know. Yes, you know a lot about history.
Well, I came from a town where Klaus Spreckles brought beet sugar over in the 19th century into California. He actually owned some Hawaiian islands. He experimented in cane. But that always amazed me because, in the Depression and the war, it was hard to get sugar, but California had an endless supply.
Oh, really?
Beet sugar.
Interesting. Yeah, I remember my family, you know, we have some like memoirs written, and they talk about, yeah, the war, the shortages of sugar and whatnot. And they would grow like a little bit of sugar cane, and like my family that lived in like Virginia and like the southern parts would actually grow sugar cane in their gardens, yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Yes. Do you have favorite recipes for this time of year, especially for larger gatherings or bringing, to parties?
I do. Everybody has their favorites, and I really like this, and after I talk, you guys feel free to try the cranberry apple crumb bars. I love cranberries because they're tart, and they bring like a little bit of a welcome counterpart to like the sweetness of a lot of, and the heaviness of a lot of like winter foods. And they're also pretty, so I like anything with cranberries. I really like cheesecake, and I have a maple cheesecake, and I like those because you can make them ahead of time. They have to be refrigerated, so you have to make them ahead of time, and then they're ready to serve. There is we're in spring now, so it's gonna take a while to get back into fall, but there's a picture of a cheesecake with cranberry swirl on top. And that's really nice. It's a cheesecake with like a little bit of like a lemon zest in there. And then I swirl the top with something that's akin to cranberry sauce at Thanksgiving, but maybe a little bit sweeter. And it just helps, again, balance that richness. Yeah.
Is it true that you can only grow cranberries in bogs? I mean, has it been cultivated any other way?
I'm not aware of it being cultivated in any way, in any different way. As far as I know, like they really need that boggy environment, and I don't know what it is specifically about that environment that they like so much, but you can find them growing wild in that exact environment. So I think that there's probably a way to do it, but I don't know if anybody has succeeded in doing so on a big scale. Another favorite thing I like to serve, I love the fudges, all the fudges. I have a wicked sweet tooth. Something for people that are gluten intolerant is maple caramel corn. So you just pop some corn, make a caramel sauce using maple syrup, and pour that over and let it harden. And sprinkle with a little bit of salt, and that's just something that you could just snack on for ages. And then the other thing that I like, pumpkin whoopie pies are also something that I like, although typically I like that for the fall more than the winter, like for Thanksgiving. There's a cranberry walnut steamed pudding that I like. Now, steamed pudding is not something that I make often or even thought about making until I wrote this book. And I thought, hey, it really would be good to have a dessert you can make on the stovetop in case you don't have an oven. Like, some people don't have an oven in there. They have like a hot plate or a microwave. Or sometimes your oven is like busy with a turkey or something and there's no room. So I tried making a steamed pudding with just a bowl, not even like a fancy mold. So you would fill a pot with water halfway, or like a third of the way, and you would put your batter into just a Pyrex bowl, and then cover it tightly, and bring the water to a boil and cover everything. So you're basically creating this steamy environment, and then you let it cook about an hour, and it comes out like a moister cake. And I wanted to make something that was very similar to sticky toffee pudding, but had New England ingredients in it. Sticky toffee pudding typically has dates in it. That's not, we have access to dates here, but we aren't known for dates here, so I wanted to use cranberries. So I made a cranberry orange walnut steamed pudding, and then made a maple cream sauce to put over it, and it's one of my favorite recipes in the book. It's really pretty, it's coming up. It'll be the one with the pine cone on top. And it's so delicious. Like, it just soaks up that maple cream. It is like amazing. So for me, that would be like a really fun sort of show-stopping one, that and the cranberry cheesecake. Yes?
Any dessert that you recommend for people who has diabetes?
Yeah, it would have to be something very low in sugar, right? That's a good question. I'm afraid to say any of this stuff because I'm not sure how much sugar is allowed for somebody who has diabetes. But one of the less sweetened desserts would be what I would think about. Probably, possibly one of the sorbets. There's a Concord grape sorbet and there's a strawberry sorbet with a little bit of rose water in it. There is some sugar in there, but you could control that and you could add less and really have the fruit flavor shine. And I mean, I suppose you could do the caramel corn and just be real light with that caramel. But again, I'm afraid because I don't want anybody to get sick. Yeah.
I was wondering, when did the New Englanders start incorporating citrus fruit, into their recipes? Because it was only available in Florida or Spanish, California.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't until, basically, I want to say refrigeration or light shipping was really, maybe the railroads. I'm not sure exactly when, but certainly it was later that people had access. And apparently the orange producers really did a lot of marketing to get people to believe that having orange juice for breakfast was really necessary for New Englanders. There are actually like fruits and vegetables that you can have here in New England that will give you that same amount of vitamin C apparently, which I didn't know. I still have my orange juice in the morning until recently, and I was like, oh. But yeah, I mean, I love baking with citrus. It's such a unique ingredient and it adds a lot to it. But I went through a couple of periods in my life where I was trying to eat very specifically hyper-local, and so I did without that. And it can be done, but it is nice to have some things, that aren't grown here once in a while, Citrus is something that's very unique, and I personally love citrus. In my first cookbook, it wasn't New England specific, it was all winter stuff. And citrus is it's more of a winter fruit than anything. You get your oranges, coming up about now, and then you've got your lemons and limes and grapefruits into the new year. And it's wonderful. I love it. I made a whole chapter on citrus fruits, and it had lemon mousse, and it had, Meyer lemon tart with rosemary. So, but to answer your question, I'm not sure of the exact date.
Wouldn't it be closer to the 1950s?
Yeah,
Early 50s when they had more refrigerated trucks.
I would say that would be my guess. Anything else? No? Okay. Well, if anybody's interested, I do have books for sale. They're $30. And if you have any other questions, come on up. And please have some more food. You're welcome to come on up. Thank you.